All right, so for many of you, Rohan will be a familiar face. We're delighted to have Rohan here today. Dr. Rohan Howitt, I should say, was a previous postdoctoral research fellow here in the Centre for Environmental History, but is now a lecturer in environmental history at Monash University. Rohan is a global and environmental historian of the Southern Ocean world, focusing on the deeply interconnected histories of Australia, Antarctica, New Zealand, and the sub-Antarctic islands, as well as the Southern Ocean itself. And today we are delighted that Rohan is bringing us this paper, which is actually based off of an article that he's written for a special issue that Rohan and I are editing together on the histories and legacies of extraction. So it fits our seminar series perfectly. It's entitled Oil from Penguins, Mentalities of Extraction in the Southern Ocean World, 1889 to 1933. So take it away, Rohan.
Thanks, Jess. A wave sweeps across a beach. As it breaks on the shore, one penguin after another is knocked off its feet in a scene that would later be described as for all the world like bathers at Bondi, Coogee or Manly on a holiday. Some of the penguins cascade into their companions, others leap playfully into the surf, and some make their way indignantly higher up the beach to join thousands of others in a throng of tiny black and white figures. This is a scene captured in a video, which I am not legally allowed to share with you, but you can get a glimpse of it from this photograph. In another photo, a crowd of penguins cluster around the rotting timbers of a ship, some seemingly engrossed in private conversations as others seem to investigate the shipwreck. In another, an advertisement for Cascade ales and beer is placed incongruously amidst a huddle of penguins on the beach. Another shows penguins in the arms and laps of explorers. Still others show a couple of king penguins, their beaks gently touching, and a couple of royal penguins framed so that it looks like they're holding hands, or rather flippers, as they walk. It is through films and photographs such as these that the world became aware of the penguins of Macquarie Island, roughly midway between Tasmania and Antarctica. Their depiction was usually treated as either comic or cute, and was accompanied by anthropomorphized descriptions of them, such as being smart little men in evening dress who have dined well, though perhaps not wisely. But for a brief period from 1916 to 22, any discussion of Macquarie Island's penguins invariably turned to a darker story. There were various versions, but that told by Frank Hurley, veteran Antarctic photographer and a fixture of the public lecture circuit, is illustrative. In his lectures, Hurley referred to the frightful and wanton savagery perpetrated at Macquarie Island. He said, "There is a sort of oil refinery, and it is right amongst the penguins. The birds are driven along the pens or runs and right up to the top of the boiler or digester. Near the top of this boiler, a man stands with a club, and as each bird reaches the top, he hits it over the head and so knocks it into the boiler. Owing to the hardiness of most of the birds, this blow only stuns them, and many of them go into the boiler alive. In this manner, approximately 150 to 200,000 birds are butchered each year." This story was exaggerated, but from 1889 to 1919, there was indeed an industry built around extracting oil from penguins at Macquarie Island. The story of boiling penguins at Macquarie crops up occasionally, often in popular media, but occasionally summarized in historical and scientific scholarship. Here's some of the examples of that popular media that has picked up the story time and again. Usually, though, it's treated as an anecdote, an interesting anecdote, or perhaps a sort of moral warning about the ecologically destructive tendencies of humans, rather than as something of wider or of lasting historical significance. So this paper is my attempt to not only reconstruct the history of Macquarie Island's penguin oil industry, but also to think through what the extraction of oil from penguins can reveal about wider mentalities of extracting value from remote sub-Antarctic islands like Macquarie. Scholarship on extraction has, not unreasonably, I must stress, focused on histories of mineral extraction. But there are many ways in which products have been extracted from plants and animals globally, such as the application of steam pressure to extract oil from penguin blubber, meat, and bone. And I think these can perhaps contribute productively to the literature of extraction. And Macquarie Island, I think, is a particularly useful case to think with. commodity frontier had already swept over and indeed moved on from Macquarie Island by the time penguin oiling kicked off in the 1890s. Macquarie had been one side of the subantarctic fur sealing boom, particularly in the 1810s and 20s, when demand for fur had driven sealers to deplete fur seal populations at various subantarctic islands to the point of unprofitability, if not extinction, before advancing kind of in search of further sealing grounds. Penguin oil was something very different. The movements of sealers and the consequent expansion of colonial jurisdiction to Southern Ocean islands had been driven by demand for an existing commodity, fur. Penguin oil had no existing market. This was an attempt to glean value from an island that had been denuded of its most readily accessible and obviously valuable resource. It is the second wave nature of this extractive frontier industry that makes it a valuable lens through which to view how a mentality of extraction shaped how people, institutions, and governments interacted with the Southern Ocean world around the turn of the 20th century. So the man behind penguin oil was New Zealander Joseph Hatch. Hatch was relentlessly ambitious. He migrated to Invercargill in 1862 and opened a drug shop. Within a decade, he had added a second drug shop, a bone mill, a soap and candle making factory, an agricultural supply company making rabbit poison and sheep dip, and a business exporting rabbit skins to his extensive list of commercial interests. And in 1873, he added another venture, purchasing a schooner and outfitting it for hunting seals around New Zealand's subantarctic islands. He combined these commercial interests with political ambitions, serving on Invercargill's municipal council before winning election to New Zealand's House of Representatives for a single term in 1884 to 1887. But his political career was derailed by his enthusiasm for sealing. Fur seals had been decimated in these islands pretty soon after their discovery in the early 19th century. New Zealand's government had eventually imposed restrictions on sealing, mainly policies passed in 1872 and strengthened in 1878. Hatch had been a vocal critic of these restrictions and had been fined for poaching in 1873. By 1887, Hatch announced that he was sending a crew to Bass Strait, where sealing in Tasmanian and Victorian waters was not regulated. In reality, he sent his schooner to the Auckland Islands to poach seals. When Hatch's men arrived at the Aucklands, they were greeted by the survivors of a shipwreck. The sealers decided to quietly take the castaways to Melbourne in the hope of avoiding suspicion, but it was quite a sensational rescue. They couldn't avoid news getting out, and the news reached Invercargill right on the eve of the 1887 election in New Zealand, which essentially confirmed Hatch's complicity in illegal sealing and meant that he was resoundingly dumped from office. With his political ambitions ruined, Hatch doubled down on his involvement in subantarctic sealing. Killing sea elephants for oil, which was essentially a lower quality, cheaper alternative to whale oil, had long been a less profitable but more reliable form of subantarctic commercial activity than fur sealing. Hatch knew this, and he had also heard reports that elephant sealers working on the Kerguelen Islands would occasionally supplement cargoes of elephant oil with oil produced from penguins. And I should say elephant oil is the term that was widely used at the time, sea elephant oil or elephant oil, just to be clear. So he connected this to his own. He reported that he remembered vast penguin rookeries when he had been near Macquarie Island as a younger man. I'm not totally convinced he was there, but that's by the by. Hatch began, therefore, planning a new venture to more systematically process both sea elephants and penguins for oil at Macquarie Island because it lay beyond the limits of New Zealand jurisdiction. So the other subantarctic islands, you can see them on this map, south of Australia and New Zealand, were part of New Zealand's territory. Macquarie Island had, since 1825, been a dependency of Tasmania. This was a source of frustration in New Zealand, but it created an opportunity for Hatch, who purchased expensive modern steam digesters from Norway and installed them at Macquarie Island over the summer of 1889-90. His first forays into oiling at Macquarie Island were highly experimental. Elephant oil was an established commodity, but no one quite knew what to make of penguin oil. And when the first shipment arrived, it was impounded while Hatch and the Bluff Customs Office argued over whether penguin oil could legally be counted as fish oil, which was taxed at 1% of its total value, or attracted the steeper levy for miscellaneous foreign cargo. So he was trying to assert that because penguins ate fish, it was fish oil. It's notable that during this quite ill-tempered dispute, the Southland Times came out swinging in support of Hatch, arguing that he was creating wealth more for the colony than for himself by turning a variety of wild creatures into commodities serviceable to humanity. The Customs Office, meanwhile, had pounced upon, hampered, and discouraged Hatch for daring to secure a modest profit from his enterprise. During the first 2 summers of oiling, Hatch's men targeted king penguins, which were the largest but least numerous of the 4 species that nest at Macquarie. But the oil extracted from kings tended to be contaminated with blood, which fermented and made the oil unusable. Thus, in 1891-92, Hatch arranged for the digesting plant to be upgraded and relocated from the king penguin rookery at the Isthmus to the much larger Royal Penguin Rookery at the Nuggets. You can see Nugget Point up here. The shift to hunting royals was what allowed an experimental oiling industry to settle into something of a pattern. The oiling season extended from August to March. Hatch's ship would land a party, usually 8 to 10 men, each August at the Nuggets. These men were employed on a sliding scale, ranging from 6 shillings 9 per 252-gallon barrel of penguin oil, from the kind of the leader of the party, down to 5 shillings 6 per barrel for general hands. Elephant oil was paid at a higher rate, but the cost of the men's tobacco and clothing was always deducted from these earnings, kind of following established maritime forms of employment. The elephant season ran from September to November. During this time, the oilers would shoot the largest bulls when they came ashore to breed. They yielded approximately 1,000 pounds of blubber, which was cut away and packed into bags to be carried across to the Nuggets, minced and crammed into the steam digesters. You can see ruined ones there. The steam digesters were primarily fueled by coal and timber brought down for the purpose, and they would run for 12 hours, after which the oil would be run off into vats and the refuse dumped. Approximately 700 sea elephants were slaughtered annually in this way. The penguin season began in mid-January, when year-old royals returned to their home rookeries. The oilers would herd these penguins into wire-netted yards, then select the fattest birds, kill them with a wooden club, and pack them into the digesters. The early digesters could process 2,000 penguins a day in this way. By the industry's later years, an enormous digester nicknamed Big Ben could extract oil from 3,500 penguins at a time. The first half of the penguin season lasted for between 18 and 20 days before the royals went to sea. They would begin returning a fortnight later, fattened and ready to molt. During the second stage of the penguin season, the oilers would place wire fences across the creek that was the royals' preferred route from the beach to the rookery at the Nuggets. A gap in the fences allowed thin birds through while keeping the preferred targets on the beach. With vast numbers of penguins, the Nuggets rookery was estimated at covering 10 acres and 500,000 penguins in 1913. So vast numbers were milling around on the beach. The oilers could continue filling the digesters for another 3 weeks, by which time the molting birds had grown too thin to produce much oil and they stopped the harvest. During an average season in the later years, approximately 150,000 penguins were killed over January and February each year. The remains of the seals and penguins were sometimes cleared out of the digesters, gathered in heaps and shipped to New Zealand for use as blood and bone meal fertilizer, but in other years was simply diverted from the creek. Water was diverted from the creek and used to simply wash away the refuse. Extracting oil from seals and penguins was arduous work. The 1917-18 diary of one of Hatch's general hands describes some days working from 3 o'clock in the morning to 7 o'clock at night, frequently in heavy rain and ferocious wind. Duties such as killing penguins and cleaning the remains left in the digesters were obviously grim tasks, but the most universally reviled. Sorry, I'm hoping this is not going to cause an issue There's an issue with the ANU security certificate. I'm hoping my slides will stay connected. Duties such as killing penguins and cleaning the remains were grim, but the most universally reviled task was rafting. So Macquarie Island was infamous for its lack of safe harbours or landing spots. Steamships is unfortunate.
That's okay. If you wanted to send me your slides, I can put them up on my computer.
I should just be able to quickly hotspot and do it that way. It was going so well until the security certificate got me.
Sorry, wrong.
No.
ANU secure Wi-Fi is trying to kick you out.
It is. Love that we're recording this.
Editing. I have zero editing skills.
Okay, let's try. All right, this should work.
We have resumed.
Steamships could come with about half a nautical mile of the landing point at the Nuggets, but Hatch relied on much smaller, cheaper ketches and schooners that had to anchor roughly 2 miles offshore. Whenever the ship arrived to collect a cargo, the oil would be transferred into 252-gallon casks, which were then hauled to the beach and tied together in long rafts. You see them doing that here. They then had to be towed through the breaking surf and out to the ship. The oilers' supplies and mail had to be packed into barrels on the ships and brought ashore in the same manner. And this was the most universally reviled job. It was really dangerous work. The boats were often swamped or overturned in heavy surf or blown miles down the coast. On other occasions, the ship itself was blown out to sea, taking 10 days in one case in 1912. It was blown away and it took another 10 days to come back because of the prevailing winds. And on other occasions, sailors were swept overboard to their deaths in the heavy seas, and 3 of Hatch's ships were shipwrecked in 1898, 1910, and 1911. Initially, Hatch ran the industry out of Invercargill. Animal oils had a wide variety of applications when the industry began in the 1890s, but penguin oil was a novel commodity that required experimentation and promotion to find a market. The primary initial application was for rope and twine making, which traditionally used whale or cod oil in the hatchling process. Manufacturers in Australia and New Zealand found penguin oil to be an excellent alternative for this process, and at least half a dozen made the switch from whale or cod to penguin. Elephant oil was also valued in the tanning industry for currying leather, and there was some use of penguin as a cheaper alternative for that. And ever the entrepreneur, Hatch used seal and penguin oils extensively in his own business ventures. He had a soap making factory, so he used it in soap making. He developed a wide range of proprietary products. I think I've got one here. Okay, this one. Notably including Hatch's sea elephant harness oil for treating leather, and Hatch's dip. So the dip was a tick preventative for sheep and cattle that not only used penguin oil as an ingredient, but the instructions recommended that the dip be mixed with equal parts straight penguin oil and then applied to sheep. It was very effective at killing ticks, but sales of the dip plummeted after tests revealed that it killed 20% of the animals treated with it as well. But there was widespread willingness to experiment with possible applications for penguin oil. There were mentions of it being used to treat wool and, intriguingly, for medicinal purposes, as well as of Hatch simply handing out sample tins at the end of public lectures. He clearly tried to export it beyond Australasia, since he was able to produce testimonials from customers in London and Belgium in 1919. The profitability of penguin oil is difficult to ascertain. Hatch openly admitted to suffering heavy losses on occasions, most notably when he lost 2 ships in as many years in 1910-11, and he ended up having his lease cancelled by the Tasmanian government in 1911 due to unpaid rent. But For most of the oiling years, Hatch remained bullish about its prospects. And when the lease was cancelled, he simply continued the trade and eventually joined with other investors to obtain a new lease under the name of the Southern Isles Exploration Company. So too did a number of those affiliated with him. For example, one of his Australian penguin oil distributors was Henry B. Smith, who had spent time on the island and observed it in action and was a robust defender of the profitability of this enterprise. There was certainly significant output. Estimates for 1896-97 were between 150 and 200 tonnes of penguin oil. That rose to roughly 225 tonnes of penguin oil and 277 tonnes of elephant oil in the penultimate oiling season of 1917-18. So there's clearly output. But on the other hand, Hatch's most vociferous critics alleged that the industry was both completely unprofitable and totally unimportant. So in 1911, Douglas Mawson criticised the wholesale slaughter of penguins for a trifling profit of 3p per head. Frank Hurley alleged in 1919 that it yielded a profit of less than a penny a bird, and Hatch's most sensational critic, the author H.G. Wells, insisted that each penguin yielded only a farthing's profit, or a quarter of a penny per penguin. It's impossible to quantify the industry's profits and losses. There's only relatively fragmentary records available, particularly as Hatch's daughter burned most of his papers after his death. But my read is that the industry was theoretically profitable, but the regular investment required in machinery and the constant heavy losses from shipwrecks and lost cargoes due to this rafting process meant that it was on paper not particularly profitable, and its viability was very precarious. But as the debate over penguin oil's profitability indicates, Hatch's project was a subject of intense and prolonged criticism. The killing of penguins for oil had been a controversial subject in New Zealand since 1890, when a petition to Parliament called on the industry to be banned due to fears that the species would be exploited to extinction. Outside of New Zealand, though, criticisms of penguin oil only began to gain traction in 1905, and the key figure in internationalising concerns about Macquarie Island's penguins was Edward Wilson, who had gained fame as the medical officer, zoologist, and artist of Robert Scott's first British Antarctic expedition in 1901 to 1904. Wilson seems to have spent approximately 3 hours at Macquarie Island doing a very brief stopover, and during that time, the oilers had not been present. But he nonetheless began issuing grave warnings about the long-term survival of the penguins almost as soon as he returned to England in 1905. His concerns spread rapidly and globally, and they morphed as they spread. By the time reports reached South Australia, for instance, Wilson's quite sombre, cautious warning had been transformed into an evocative plea. One newspaper warned that once the cauldron fires are lighted, they will not be allowed to die out till the last survivor of the host has been flung into the seething broth. Surely no effort should be spared to frustrate this diabolical scheme. It was around this time that allegations of, to use the words of one distressed New Zealand MP, penguins being driven along planks and precipitated into a boiling cauldron began to spread. This claim was nonsense. Penguins were killed and carefully packed into the digesters to maximise efficiency and yield. The practice of packing them involved a person standing inside the digesters to place the penguins carefully. But the rumour about kind of penguins boiled alive was resilient. There was a kernel of truth at the heart of the myth. One member of the oiling parties between 1896 and 1900 reported that they would often select and club penguins in the morning before stopping for breakfast. When they returned, many of the penguins were found to require reclubbing before they could be packed into the digesters. And I think this is the nugget of truth that seems to be the source of the erroneous story of penguins being boiled alive. But taken together, these examples encapsulate the two main veins of criticism of the penguin oil industry. First, that the species was at risk of imminent extinction due to the oilers' indiscriminate slaughter, and two, that the oilers used particularly cruel methods. Hatch and his supporters aggressively rebutted both lines of criticism, but these ideas resurfaced regularly over the next 2 decades and played a crucial role in the industry's demise. The same ideas were picked up by the Times in London in 1910 and the Royal Australasian Ornithologists' Union in 1912. But the man at the centre of what was emerging into a campaign to end penguin oil was Australian explorer Douglas Mawson. Mawson excoriated Hatch in remarks to the press shortly before heading south for the first Australasian Antarctic expedition in 1911. He then returned to his criticisms in an essay for a book designed to raise funds for the Red Cross in 1916. After declaring Macquarie Island to be one of the wonder spots of the world and describing its penguins in those familiarly anthropomorphic terms that I started the paper with, Mawson asked if Australians would play the part of the greatest destroyer the world has ever seen, or will we take a thought for the future and save the situation? He declared that the future of the animals is in our hands, and he called on the Commonwealth to designate Macquarie Island a wildlife refuge. And this essay marked an interesting shift in discourse, going beyond raising concerns about the industry to articulating that more ambitious vision for Macquarie Island as a sanctuary for sub-Antarctic fauna. Mawson was also active behind the scenes. He secured the support of Governor-General Ronald Munro Ferguson and submitted reports and recommendations to various federal departments. Mawson and his allies succeeded in persuading the acting Prime Minister to ask Tasmania to transfer the island to federal control so that it could be made a sanctuary. But that plan collapsed when Tasmania's treasurer insisted that the island had a carrying capacity of 18,000 sheep and that the state could therefore only part with the island for compensation for pastoral land of 5 shillings per acre, which amounted to about £14,000. The Commonwealth had no intention of paying to take the island, and the idea of a sanctuary lapsed. Those same criticisms re-emerged in 1918. The Adelaide Advertiser led the charge by repeating the old rumour that penguins were forced to waddle up a plank, at the end of which the poor birds drop into the boiling water alive and die in agony. Hatch, in the face of these criticisms, tried to defend his operation, including by agreeing to address his critics directly at a meeting of the Field Naturalists Club of Victoria. He mounted a passionate defence of penguin oil, but this lecture was derailed by reports that emerged that he had admitted to killing 1.5 million penguins each year. The number was totally wildly inflated. I'm not sure if that was Hatch. He was 81 years old by that time. He may have misspoken. It could have been miswritten by the club secretary, but that number of 1.5 million was picked up by various scientific, ornithological, and wildlife preservation societies across Australia, Britain, and New Zealand, and it just added further fuel to the fire. All of this criticism forced the Tasmanian government into a compromise. Hatch's lease was extended for another year, but additional restrictions were added. Some were sensible. So, for example, the existing digesting plant could not be extended further. Others betrayed the sheer lack of knowledge that existed about the island. So, for example, Hatch was banned from killing emperor penguins, the nearest colony of which was 2,500 kilometres further south. Having failed to conclusively end the trade, Hatch's critics launched their most sustained and coordinated campaign yet. A dozen or so organisations began simultaneously lobbying for the creation of a wildlife sanctuary. In England, Wilson's former assistant, Apsley Cherry Garrard, took up the campaign in the pages of The Spectator and The Times. Cherry Garrard enlisted his friend, H.G. Wells, to incorporate his disgust at the vile traffic in penguin oil into his 1919 novel, The Undying Fire. In Australia, Mawson and his former photographer, Frank Hurley, took to the lecture circuit. And Hurley, who was a flamboyant writer and a charismatic speaker, emerged as by far the most effective of Hatch's critics. In a series of lectures and letters to newspapers across August and September 1919, Hurley managed to make Macquarie Island a major issue in New South Wales, which persuaded the state's premier to call on his Tasmanian counterpart to cancel Hatch's lease. And there were two peculiar features of this increasingly prominent campaign to end the extraction of oil from penguins. The first was the relative absence of criticism from those with first-hand experience of the industry. While Mawson, Hurley, and Cherry Garrard all invoked their status as Antarctic veterans to legitimise their criticisms, none of them had ever actually witnessed penguin oiling themselves. They'd all been to the island, but they hadn't seen it when the oiling season was active. By contrast, those who had spent considerable time on the island and lived and worked alongside the oilers tended to be quite sympathetic. Augustus Hamilton, a naturalist who spent a fair amount of time there in 1894, argued that the industry made no impression on the penguin population. The members of Mawson's expedition, who had been stationed at Macquarie for 2 years, reported that the oilers' methods were as humane as any that could be adopted, and that the number of penguins seemed to be increasing despite the killing of between 150 and 200,000 per year. The meteorologist stationed at Macquarie in 1915 said the same, and the Commonwealth government went back to these figures and said, "Are you sure?" And they said, yes, we still think this. So it's quite interesting. But those dissenting voices were drowned out in what was an increasingly rancorous public debate. With that said, they probably gave a more accurate depiction of affairs at Macquarie than the likes of Mawson or Hurley did. Writing in the 1960s, the New Zealand ornithologist R.A. Fowler, who had done field work at Macquarie in 1930 and again in 1957, came to the conclusion that there was no observable relationship between the oiling industry and population changes at the Nuggets, which was the only rookery that the oilers worked over the long term. They had definitely had an effect on the king penguin population, but had abandoned that after 2 years. The second peculiar feature of the transnational campaign to end penguin oiling was the degree to which arguments against penguin oil were informed by the same mentality of extraction that informed the arguments for it. Mawson and his allies had a clear vision for Macquarie Island as a sanctuary for unique and threatened Antarctic fauna. In practice, though, this conservationist vision was not far removed from Hatch's openly extractivist one. To make the fauna reserve financially self-supporting, or perhaps even produce a small profit, Mawson suggested maintaining a meteorological station at Macquarie and having the staff act as caretakers. He believed the caretakers' responsibilities would include killing redundant male sea elephants for their hides and oil, processing residual carcasses for blood and bone fertilizer, cultivating foxes to supply the fur trade, the foxes being fed the meaty refuse left after processing elephant seals, collecting skins, skeletons, and plumage from penguins to sell to museums and collectors, developing a dried penguin egg industry for export to Australia, and maintaining flocks of sheep and potentially cattle or reindeer. Mawson had allies in this. The Tasmanian governor, William Allardyce, who had overseen the establishment of whaling in the Falkland Islands dependencies when he was governor there, he believed Macquarie Island could be developed into a very productive dependency while serving as an animal sanctuary. He endorsed all of Mawson's ideas, but added that fur seals could be farmed by transplanting young pups from distant rookeries near the Falklands, forcing them to recolonise Macquarie rather than return to their home rookeries. Put simply, proponents of a sanctuary were not opposed to the idea of extracting value from a wasteland on the margins of Australian territory. They just wanted those industries to be conducted along what they considered scientifically managed lines. Mawson didn't even want the oiling industry banned outright. He wanted an end to the inefficient killing of penguins, but he was open to the scientifically managed killing of sea elephants, fur seals, or even whales. He had even toyed with the idea of a penguin oil industry himself. He collected samples of Adelie penguin oil during his own Antarctic expedition and sent them off to be studied at the Imperial Institute to determine if it offered an alternative to whale oil for hydrogenated products like soap and margarine. Cherry Garrard supported regulated whaling, but wanted the killing of penguins to be absolutely forbidden. Hurley echoed Mawson, arguing that penguins should be exploited, but for their eggs rather than their oil. I'm not trying to suggest that Macquarie Island was unique in this regard. I think there's some really interesting comparisons to be drawn with other cases, such as Paul Crichton's study of bird killing and bird conservation in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands. In both of these cases, enormous numbers of birds were slaughtered on islands on the periphery of colonial territory. In both cases, exaggerated allegations of excessive cruelty were mobilized to condemn the commercial slaughter of birds, while campaigners took full advantage of political connections to have protection considered at the kind of top tiers of government. But in both cases, conservationists seem to have objected not to the principle of exploiting birds, but to who profited from the industry and how it was organised. With such an intense campaign against the continuation of the industry, the Tasmanian government opted to quietly decline to renew Hatch's lease at the end of 1919. A furious Hatch tried to salvage his business and his reputation by challenging Hurley to a public debate. Hurley accepted, then slipped away to Brisbane when Hatch turned up in Sydney. Hatch then tried organising his own public lectures and producing statements from his former employees denying the allegations of cruelty or of any risk of extinction to the penguins. And he continued to make attempts to clear his name, even after his company had been liquidated, including demanding compensation from the Tasmanian government, calling for a public inquiry into his treatment, holding public lectures, including one specifically for children, which reportedly used photos to demonstrate the method by which oil was extracted from their bodies. He even launched a chaotic campaign for the state seat of Denison in 1922, but his desire for personal vengeance evidently failed to inspire the electorate because he came last with 32 votes. And after that, he gradually receded from public view in the years before his death in 1928, aged 91. Joseph Hatch's 30-year project to glean value from a remote subantarctic island that had already been denuded of its most obvious resource, fur seals, is in many ways an exceptional case. It was a novel commodity without any established applications, markets, or distribution networks. Most other attempts to extract value from the subantarctic were less novel and less provocative, focusing on known quantities like whaling, sealing, or the extension of the limits of pastoralism. Yet I see this less as an exception than a case of the exceptional typical. That Hatch could look upon vast penguin rookeries and see an untapped resource reveals something of a wider mentality of extraction. Until the 1920s and 30s, and in some cases much later, the subantarctic islands were imagined as ripe for economic development if only the right resource and the right industry could be found. Some boosters and entrepreneurs favoured experimenting with productive industries, such as sheep and poultry farming. Others favoured extraction of mineral from rocks, water from icebergs, krill from the sea, and oil from penguins. Global histories of extraction and commodity frontiers tend to focus on expansion as an attempt to find new spaces for development or new sources of known commodities to meet the rapacious demands of global capitalism. Penguin oil provides a glimpse into a different kind of process, a drive to extract value out of hitherto underutilized marginal spaces and underutilized animals and resources. It's also notable that penguin oil sparked one of the earliest and most effective transnational campaigns for the conservation of animals. Yet even this campaign for an animal sanctuary was not a repudiation of the logics that underpinned the industry itself. This was an instrumental conservationism, one in which subantarctic ecosystems could continue to be exploited along scientifically planned, closely regulated lines to subsidize the costs of protection for specific species, such as penguins and seals, or even to produce revenue. Hatch and his opponents shared a vision of extracting value from the subantarctic. They simply differed in how they believed it should be done. And the interesting coda to the dispute over penguin oil is that the 20-year project to extract oil from such a charismatic, readily anthropomorphized animal led to changes in how this slice of the subantarctic was imagined. The scientifically managed industries endorsed by Mawson and his fellow critics broadly failed to eventuate. Instead, a bespoke system of environmental protection slowly developed at Macquarie. After Hatch's lease lapsed in 1919, the island was eventually declared a sanctuary in 1933. They made a state reserve in 1977 and designated part of a World Heritage Area in 1997. Mawson, Hurley, and their allies sought to draw attention to the uniqueness of subantarctic biota and mobilised Macquarie Island's charismatic penguins to support their alternative vision for the Southern Ocean world. In doing so, they contributed to a shift in attitudes that grew gradually into a more ambitious version of conservation than they had ever called for. I'll finish up there and happy to chat more.